Hello and welcome. I'm Aiden, your narrator for tonight. I'm glad you made time for this. Take a slow breath, let the day grow distant, and let yourself arrive here. Tonight, I'll tell you a story called The Secret of the Lush Garden. A tale about Sable, a botanist who has inherited a walled garden from an aunt she barely knew. The garden has been locked and untended for years, and Sable has spent 3 weeks working through its outer layers, clearing, cataloguing, learning its structure. Tonight she goes further in than she has before, and the garden reveals itself in the late evening light. Older than she expected, stranger than any reference she carries, and alive in ways that the daylight had not shown her. This is a story about what grows in quiet and what a garden knows that no book records. Before we begin, we'd love to know where you are tonight. What room, what hour, what kind of evening you've had. And if there are worlds you'd like Terranash to visit next, please leave them in the comments. Every suggestion finds its way into what we make. If you'd like to be part of something a little closer, our Patreon is a warm and unhurried place where early stories and quiet extras wait for those who want to go deeper. And if Terranash has found its way into your evenings, a subscription is the simplest gift you can give us. It costs nothing and keeps this world alive. Now let yourself settle fully. Feel the weight of your body against the surface beneath you. Take one slow breath in, and as you release it, let your shoulders soften and your jaw unclench. There is nothing to hold on to tonight. Let the day become something that happened somewhere else, to someone who no longer needs you. When you're ready, let's step together through the old oak door in the garden wall, into the green and the fragrance and the slow evening light, where Sable has just found the path that leads to the garden's heart. The secret of the lush garden. Narration. The key was iron and older than anything else she owned. Sable had inherited it along with the deed and the solicitor's letter and the photographs taken by the estate agent who had been the last person through the gate 3 years prior. In the photographs, the garden was visible in fragments. A stone wall draped in something that might have been wisteria. A flagstone path disappearing into greenery so dense it made the path look like a tunnel. A rusted iron bench, half submerged in what appeared to be some variety of ornamental grass run wild. The estate agent had described it as mature landscaping with significant restoration potential. What this meant, Sable now understood, was that the garden had been growing uninterrupted for long enough to forget that it had ever been managed. She had driven down from the city at the beginning of the month with her reference books and her field notebooks and her pruning tools and her particular brand of professional optimism. She was 42 years old and had spent 20 of those years identifying, cataloguing, and writing about plants in various capacities, in universities, in botanical gardens, in consultancy roles for organizations that needed to know what was growing in places that had been left to themselves. Sable had seen overgrown gardens before. The botanist had not seen this garden. The wall was 8 feet high and ran in a near-perfect rectangle around what she had estimated, from the outside, to be roughly half an acre. The oak door in the south-facing wall had a lock that the iron key fit with a resistance that felt less like rust and more like the lock simply needed persuading. On the first day she had oiled it and persuaded it, and it had opened, and the smell of the garden had come out at her like something that had been held under pressure, rich and complex and warm, with the particular density of air that had been circulating in an enclosed space through a long summer. 3 weeks later, she was still working through the outer sections. The garden had more structure than the photographs had suggested. There were beds and paths, and even, she had discovered in the second week, a series of raised stone planters along the western wall that were planted with something she had not yet identified to her satisfaction. The outer sections were the more conventional ones. Herbs she recognized, climbing roses in varieties she could name, espaliered fruit trees along the east wall in varieties she could only approximately place. These were old varieties. The garden had been planted by someone who knew what they were doing and who had access to cultivars that were no longer commonly available. Each evening for 3 weeks she had worked until the light went and then walked back through the door and locked it and driven to the cottage she was renting half a mile down the lane. Each evening she had come a little further in. Tonight she had come further in than before. The inner sections of the garden were different. She had begun to suspect this in the second week, when the plants she was recording started to resist easy identification. Not dramatically, not plants that were obviously unknown or exotic, but plants that were almost familiar, that matched 90% of the description of a known species, and then diverged in small ways that made her pause and look again. A salvia with the right leaf shape and the right stem structure, but a flower color she had not seen in any salvia she'd encountered. A climbing plant against the inner wall that had the growth pattern of a clematis, but a leaf that was smoother and more pointed than any clematis she could name. She had taken samples and photographs and had not yet found a satisfactory match. Tonight, the evening light was extraordinary. It was the quality of light that happened in high summer, in the late hour before sunset. Not golden yet, but moving toward it. The sun at an angle that made every surface it touched glow from within, rather than simply being lit. In the walled garden, enclosed and still, this light was intensified. The walls absorbed it and re-radiated it. The leaves caught it and transmitted it into greens of varying depth and luminosity, and the whole enclosed space had the quality of a room lit by multiple gentle sources, rather than one strong, direct one. Sable moved slowly. She had learned, in 3 weeks, to move slowly in this garden. It rewarded slowness. If she moved quickly, she saw plants. If she moved slowly, she saw the garden. There was a path she had not noticed before. It ran from the center of the inner section, which she had reached for the first time yesterday, finding it to be a wide circular area of what appeared to be extremely fine lawn grass, cropped close despite there being no evidence of recent mowing, and it went further toward what she had assumed was the north wall. But the path curved slightly, and what she had taken for the north wall was in fact a dense planting of tall hedging that concealed something behind it. She followed the path. The hedging was yew. She was confident about that. The tight, dark needle leaf was unmistakable, the red berries just beginning to form at the tips of this year's growth. The yew was old. She put her hand against the trunk of the nearest tree, and it was the diameter of something planted at least a century ago, possibly more. Someone had shaped it, not recently, but it had been shaped into a wall of solid green that was 8 feet high and apparently continuous. The path ran along its base and curved, and then there was an opening, not a formal archway, but a gap in the planting, and she stepped through it. The inner garden was inside the garden. She had not known it was there. 3 weeks of systematic work through the outer sections, 3 weeks of reference books and field notes and careful progress, and she had not known this space existed. It was smaller than the outer garden, perhaps a quarter of the whole, and it was different in every quality. The outer garden was lush and overgrown, but its structure was that of a designed garden that had been left. This space had a different relationship with design. It was not designed in any way she could identify, and it was not overgrown in the way the outer sections were. It was simply abundant. Every surface was growing something. Every square foot of ground was claimed. But there was nothing chaotic about it. There was no sense of competition or crowding. The plants occupying their space with the ease of things that had been here long enough to negotiate their territory and had arrived at a settled arrangement. In the center of the space, there was water. A pool, perhaps 4 meters across, roughly circular, edged not with stone, but with the same fine grass she had found at the circular lawn. The water was clear. She could see the bottom, which was covered in a fine dark silt, and through which she could see the faint movement of something that was either very fine plant material, moving in a current, or small creatures. She couldn't determine which from where she stood. The water was still on the surface. It reflected the sky above, which was the deep blue of the high summer evening, and the plants that surrounded it, and the first star that had appeared in the east, and her own face when she leaned carefully forward and looked. There was a sound she had not heard in the outer garden, low, continuous, at the edge of perception, not quite a sound, more a quality of the air. She stood still and listened, and it resolved slowly into the sound of water moving underground, beneath the pool, the faint resonance of a spring feeding the basin from below. The pool was spring-fed. It had always been spring-fed. This was why it was clear. She sat down on the grass at the pool's edge. She had her field notebook in her hand, and she had intended to begin recording, but she sat for a long moment without opening it. The garden around her was making sounds she had not expected, not the sounds of wind in leaves, because the air in the enclosed space was still, but the sound of the garden itself, the small, close sounds of insects, of something moving in the dense planting at the far edge, of the water below the pool's surface continuing its slow, ancient ascent through whatever channel brought it here. She opened her notebook and began to record what she could see. The plants around the pool were of a different category from anything in the outer garden. She had spent 20 years building a working knowledge of cultivated and wild plants across 3 continents, and what she was looking at now did not fit cleanly into any of her categories. Not because the individual plants were radically unfamiliar. She could identify the general family of most of them, could place them in genera she knew, but because each one had a quality of modification or adaptation that she couldn't account for. Closest to the pool's edge, a low-growing plant with round leaves that were waxy and pale on the upper surface and dark underneath, with the underside having a faint iridescence that she could only see when she tilted her head at a specific angle to catch the remaining light. The iridescence was blue-green, like the inside of a shell or the surface of a soap bubble. She had never seen it in a leaf before. She photographed it from 4 angles and made a detailed sketch and wrote 3 pages of description, and still felt she had not captured the quality that made it remarkable. Further from the pool, taller plants, some of them head height, with a variety of leaf forms and flower states, some still in bloom, some setting seed in species that should not have been blooming simultaneously in the same season. A plant in full flower whose family bloomed in spring. Beside it, a plant just finishing its summer bloom and already fat with seed. Both growing together in the same bed, their roots presumably sharing the same soil, their schedules arranged somehow around each other, rather than around the calendar she would have expected them to follow. She wrote, "The garden does not keep ordinary time." She had not intended to write this, had not thought it consciously before her pen set it down. She looked at the sentence for a moment. It was not a scientific observation. It was the kind of thing she would normally cross out. She left it. The evening light was deepening around her. The high blue of the sky was shifting toward the violet grey that preceded proper dark, and the last horizontal light was now coming through a gap in the yew hedge at the western end of the inner garden, a shaft of amber that moved across the pool and lit the water briefly from the side, showing her the interior of the pool with a clarity she hadn't had before. She could see the bottom clearly now. The dark silt, yes, but also something else. At the pool's deepest point, which was in the center, a faint upwelling of sand, the telltale cone of disturbed silt that marked where the spring entered the pool from below. The water was moving. It had always been moving. She had mistaken its stillness for stasis. After the light shifted, the garden became something else. Not darker, exactly. The sky above was still blue, and there was still plenty of ambient light in the enclosed space. But the quality of the light changed as the direct sun left the inner garden, becoming softer and more even. And in that softer light, the plants she had been looking at were different. The iridescence on the round-leafed plant at the pool's edge was more visible, not less. It glowed faintly in the ambient light in a way it had not in the direct light of earlier. She had photographed it in full light and had captured almost nothing of the quality she'd observed. She photographed it now and watched the small screen of her camera and thought, yes, that is closer. Something moved at the far edge of the pool. She did not startle, she was not easily startled, but she was aware of a shift in her attention, a sudden focusing of everything toward the movement she had registered at the periphery of her vision. She turned her head slowly. A frog. An ordinary garden frog, the particular brown gold of its species, sitting at the pool's edge with the absolute stillness that frogs achieved, and that she had always found remarkable. The ability to be perfectly still, to hold position for minutes at a time, without any of the micro-adjustments that were the constant background noise of a human body. It was looking at the water. She watched it look at the water for a long time. Then it entered the pool in a movement so economical it barely disturbed the surface. A small push with its back legs, a brief opening of its foot webbing, and it was underwater and moving away from her through the clear water toward the far edge, its legs working in the unhurried sequence of something that had all the time it needed. She watched it until it reached the far side and settled into the vegetation at the pool's edge and became invisible. The garden was completely quiet for a moment. Then the sounds resumed, the insects, the underground water, the small movements in the dense planting, as though the frog's exit had been a pause and not an ending. She became aware that she was very comfortable. The grass beneath her was extraordinarily fine and dense, the kind of lawn quality that took generations of managed turf to achieve, and that had apparently achieved itself here in the absence of management. It was slightly damp with the evening dew that was beginning to settle, and the dampness was not unpleasant. It was the particular cool cleanness of dew on fine grass, and it was conducting the warmth of the soil underneath to her palms, where they rested on the ground. She set her field notebook beside her on the grass. She would return to it. She always returned to it. For now, she wanted to simply be in this place without the mediation of recording it. The smell of the inner garden was different from the outer garden. The outer garden smelled as a garden should. The various specific scents of its various specific plants layered over the general background of soil and green matter, and the particular warmth that plant-dense enclosed spaces accumulated through long days. She knew those smells. She had been cataloguing them along with everything else for 3 weeks. The inner garden had a scent she could not place. It was not one thing. It was a combination, and the combination shifted as she moved, or as the small air currents in the enclosed space shifted. At moments, it was something like the smell of a forest after rain, the deep, earthy resonance of wet soil and decomposing matter, and the specific mineral quality of wet stone. At other moments, it was something sweeter and more floral, close to night-blooming flowers, but not quite. There was something green beneath it, something sap-like, something alive in a way that floral scents usually weren't, and at moments she couldn't characterize it at all. It was simply a quality of the air, a density to it, a sense that she was breathing something that was more fully itself than the ordinary air she moved through in ordinary places. She thought about her aunt. She had met her once, at a family gathering when Sable was 8 or 9, a tall woman with paint-stained hands and a large quantity of dark hair and a quality of absolute self-possession that Sable had found both impressive and slightly alarming. Her aunt had known about plants. She remembered this specifically. There had been a conversation about a garden, about something her aunt had been growing, about the particular patience required for certain things to establish themselves. Sable had been too young to follow the conversation fully, and had remembered it only in outline. She thought, this garden is the thing my aunt was growing. The patience required had been decades. The garden had been establishing itself through all those decades, behind its 8-foot wall, in its own time and according to its own logic. And her aunt had known this and had left it to do so, and had left it, in the end, to Sable. The first star had been joined by others. The sky above the walled garden was now showing a dozen, the brightest ones, the ones that appeared first. The plants around her were silhouettes against the darkening sky, their shapes more distinct now that they were not competing with the complexity of full-color daylight. She could see the forms of them clearly, the round-leafed plant at the water's edge, the tall, flowering plant beside it, the dense mass of the unnamed climbing plant along the yew hedge's inner face, all of them still, all of them present. The pool reflected the stars. She lay back on the grass. The dew was heavier now, and the grass was cool and fine beneath her, and the sky above the inner garden was showing properly dark between the stars, the blue fully gone, the depth of the night sky beginning to reveal itself in the way that it only revealed itself away from city light, with actual depth, with the sense that it was not a surface but a volume, that the stars were at genuinely different distances, and the space between them was genuinely enormous. From lying down, the garden was a different world again. The plants were above her now, their stems and leaves making a partial canopy between her and the sky, moving slightly with whatever air there was at that height, even when the air at ground level was still. The faint iridescence of the round-leafed plant was visible even from a distance, even in the dark, a barely there gleam that she registered more as a quality of light than as light itself. She thought, I have been a person who catalogues things. This was true. Her life's work was a very long and detailed act of naming, of encountering the living world and attaching language to it, organizing it into categories, building the accumulative record that was the practical purpose of botany. She was good at this. She believed in it. The naming was necessary, the categories were useful, the record mattered. But lying in this garden, she was aware of something that the naming did not reach. The garden existed in its own right, with its own logic and its own time and its own arrangements. And her naming of it was something she did, not something she did to it. The garden was not changed by being catalogued. It continued exactly as it had been continuing through all the years before she arrived with her notebooks. She found this comforting. It was a specific comfort, the comfort of things existing independently of one's attention to them. The garden had been here and would continue. The spring-fed pool had been reflecting the sky above it through every night of its existence, whether anyone was here to see the reflection or not. The particular iridescent quality of the round-leafed plant at the water's edge had been present in the dim light of every summer evening, for however many summers this plant had been growing here, regardless of whether any botanist had photographed it or taken a sample or written 3 pages of description in a field notebook. The crickets had begun, not loudly, a single tentative sound first, then a second voice joining it, then a third at a slightly different interval, until there was a loose and gentle chorus that was not music, but had music's quality of multiple things happening in relation to each other. She listened to it. The pool continued its reflection. The plants continued their slow breathing. Something very small moved across her hand where it rested on the grass. Too small to see, felt only as a brief, faint pressure and then gone. An insect, part of the garden's long accounting. The night-blooming plants opened while she was lying there. She was not sure exactly when it happened. She had been watching the sky, and then she became aware of a new element in the scent of the air, something that had not been present before, something sweet and deep and cool that was unmistakably a flower. She sat up and looked. Along the inner face of the yew hedge, at intervals she had not noticed in the daylight, white flowers were opening. Not dramatically, they opened the way all flowers opened, which was slowly and without announcement. But in the dark, their whiteness was visible in a way that daylight would have muted. They were large, each flower perhaps the size of her hand, with petals of the kind of white that was not flat but layered, each petal having a slight translucency that let the dimmer light of the others behind it pass through. The smell they released was the new note she had registered, deep, sweet, cool, something that the dictionary of familiar flower scents did not have an entry for. She got up and moved toward the hedge slowly. The climbing plant she had been unable to identify was the one that was flowering. She could see the structure of it now in the half-dark, the way it had wound itself through the yew's branches over what must have been years of growth, using the rigid hedge as an armature for its own sprawling form. The flowers emerged from the dark structure of the combined plants like stars emerging from dark sky, white, irregularly spaced, each one a source of the smell she had been breathing. She stood in front of the hedge and breathed. She thought, my aunt knew this was here. She knew it would be here tonight, on this evening in this season, and she left it for someone who would know what to do with it. Or perhaps just someone who would come and stand here and breathe it in. Perhaps those are the same thing. The pool behind her reflected the white flowers dimly. She could see this when she turned, the faint doubled forms of the open flowers in the dark water, surrounded by stars. She stayed for a long time in front of the hedge. She did not leave immediately. She had intended to, had told herself, when the white flowers opened and she stood before them, that she would note what she observed and then walk back through the garden and lock the gate. But the inner garden had a quality in the full dark that the outer garden did not have, and she found that her intention to leave simply did not become action. She stood before the flowering hedge, and then she went back to the pool and sat down again, and the sitting down felt like the correct thing to do. The pool in the full dark was remarkable. The moonlight had reached it through the gap in the yew hedge. The moon was high enough now to clear the hedge's top and fall directly into the inner garden, and its light on the water was the specific silver of full moon reflection. Absolute, cool, slightly unreal. The pool was a disk of light in the dark grass. She could see the faint disturbance at its center where the spring entered from below, visible now not as a movement of sand, but as a slight vibration in the moonlit surface. A circular ripple that expanded from the center outward in slow pulses, each one traveling to the edge and disappearing, replaced immediately by the next. The spring's pulse, slower than a heartbeat, faster than breathing. Its own rhythm, older than either. The stars above were fully visible now, dense in the aperture of sky above the walled garden. She had grown up in cities and had not, until she started doing field work in remote locations in her late 20s, understood what the sky looked like without light pollution. Even now, living primarily in the city, she was occasionally surprised by it, by the sheer quantity of stars available when the light below was insufficient to compete with them. The garden's walls blocked the ambient glow of the nearest village effectively enough that the sky above it was as dark as countryside sky, and the stars that were visible numbered in the hundreds. She found the pattern she always found first, the 3-star line of Orion's belt, then the surrounding shape of the constellation, then the bright star at its shoulder. She had been finding it since she was a child, and her father had shown her, pointing up from the back garden of their terraced house in a gap between the sodium lights, saying, "Those 3, there, always those 3. The inner garden in the dark had a sound she had not heard earlier. It was very quiet and very close. A sound from the pool itself, she realized after a moment, the faintest surface sound of the springs upwelling, the water moving against water in a way that was almost inaudible, but that in the complete stillness of the enclosed garden at this hour was exactly audible. She had sat beside many water sources in her fieldwork. This sound was different from all of them, not louder or quieter, but more intimate somehow, as though the pool were making the sound for itself rather than as a byproduct of its own process. She took out her torch and held it but did not turn it on. She preferred the dark. This surprised her. She was a practical person, someone who kept working tools in the proper state of readiness and used them without ceremony. But the torch in the dark of this garden would have been a disruption rather than an aid. The garden was already giving her everything she needed to see: the moonlight, the reflection in the pool, the faint gleam of the iridescent plants at the water's edge, the white flowers open against the dark hedge. Artificial light would have flattened all of this into the ordinary. She put the torch back in her pocket. A moth came to the white flowers, a large one. She could see its wingspan silhouetted briefly against the pale flowers before it settled on one and folded its wings. The movement of its settling disturbed the flower slightly, and a faint additional release of scent came toward her across the pool. She was certain of this, could distinguish the fresh note in the air from what had been present before. The relationship between this flower and this moth, worked out over however many summers this garden had been growing, was a private and ancient arrangement that had nothing to do with her, and that she was the beneficiary of by simply being present. She thought, this is what the outer garden was protecting. All those years of the wall, all those years of the locked oak door, and the key kept by her aunt, and passed down to her, they had been protecting this space. Not from harm exactly, but from the quality of attention that would have changed it. The outer garden had been the buffer, the visible garden, the garden available to the estate agent's camera. The inner garden had been here all along, behind the yew hedge, keeping its own counsel. She sat beside the pool and watched the moonlight on the water, and listened to the spring, and the moths came to the white flowers and went, and the stars moved imperceptibly through their arc overhead, and the plants around her continued their night's work in the unhurried way of things that had been doing it for a long time and expected to continue. She was not lonely. She had been sometimes, in the 3 weeks since arriving. The evenings in the rented cottage had been quiet in a way that occasionally had an edge to it, the particular quiet of a person between one life and another who was not yet certain what the next one would look like. But here, in this garden, the quiet was not that kind. It was simply the quiet of a place going about its own business, and she was part of the scene rather than outside of it, and it was enough. She stayed until the moon had moved past the gap in the yew hedge and the inner garden was in shadow again. When she finally walked back through the yew hedge gap and along the path through the outer garden and out through the oak door and locked it behind her, the night was full and the first bats were moving against the sky. She stood for a moment outside the wall and looked up. The bats moved in the particular erratic precision of their echolocation-guided flight, adjusting and readjusting their path with a speed that made the adjustments look random, but which were, she knew, the exact opposite. Each swerve a response to a precise signal returned from a precise object in the dark around them. They were hunting moths. The moths were in the air above the garden wall, drawn up by whatever warmth and scent was still rising from the enclosed space. She walked back down the lane to the cottage. In the kitchen, she made tea without turning on the overhead light. The window let in enough moonlight, and she didn't want the quality of the dark to change yet. She sat at the kitchen table with her tea and her field notebook open in front of her, and looked at what she had written. The pages were full. The 3 pages about the round-leafed plant, the notes about the simultaneous blooming anomaly, the observation about the spring, the sketch of the pool and its dimensions as best she could estimate them, the description of the night-blooming climber and its flower structure. 6 pages in total, which was a great deal for a single evening. At the bottom of the last page, in her own handwriting, was the sentence, "The garden does not keep ordinary time." She sat with it for a while, and then she added, beneath it, "Perhaps that is what the wall is for, to give it a space where its own time is sufficient." She closed the notebook. Outside the kitchen window, the walled garden was there in the dark at the end of the lane, its 8-foot wall visible as a darker rectangle against the sky, the oak door with its iron lock holding the interior from the outside world. Inside the wall, the pool was receiving whatever moonlight reached the inner garden through the gap in the yew hedge, and the white night-blooming flowers were open, and the spring was moving below the surface of the water as it had always moved, and the round-leafed plants at the pool's edge were showing their faint iridescence to the dark, and the crickets were continuing their patient three-voice chorus to no one in particular. The garden was keeping its own time. Sable finished her tea, set the cup in the sink, and went to bed. She dreamed of green, not one kind of green but many, the specific green of the iridescent leaf in the half-light, the darker green of the yew hedge's interior, the pale, bright green of the fine lawn grass where she had sat, the deep green-black of the pool in the dark, all the greens of the garden layered over each other, in the particular way that sleep layers things, without priority or sequence, everything present at once in the way that things are only present in dreams and in gardens that do not keep ordinary time. She woke in the morning, knowing she would go back. The iron key was on the kitchen table where she had left it. Outside, the lane was bright with early summer light, and the birds were doing what they always did. At the end of the lane, the wall was there, the door was there, the garden was there behind it, going about its own business in its own time. She would go back this evening, and the evening after, and for as many evenings as the summer gave her, cataloguing what could be catalogued, sitting with what couldn't, learning the garden the way the garden wanted to be learned, slowly, and from the inside, and without assuming she already knew what she would find.